Today I'm going to be showing you guys a nearly perfected version of the Shadow Rogue build. I know a lot of you guys have been waiting to be updated on this, so here it is. This build is still, in my opinion, probably one of the best, if not the single best rogue build if you're interested in just absolutely blasting through the game. If you're leveling from 50 to 100, or you're just level 100 and you're trying to speed farm Nightmare Dungeons to get some Glyph XP, or you're literally just doing anything in the game, as long as you're not doing incredibly high Nightmare Dungeons, this is probably the single best rogue build in the game, simply just because of how efficient and how strong it is at just clearing massive packs of mobs, and pretty much just having the most mobility ever. As you can see, the build just absolutely pumps, and it's a ton of fun, pretty much just annihilating and one-shotting everything in your path. I do want to reiterate though that as rogue is incredibly squishy, if your goal is to do incredibly high nightmare tier dungeons like above 75s, this is not going to be the build for you, but 99% of you guys I imagine aren't really interested in that, so as long as you're not doing incredibly high tier nightmare dungeons, this build should be absolutely perfect for you. The main difference between this version and my previous version is I kind of just changed around some of my gear, but I also made a completely new Paragon board that is infinitely more optimized, so make sure to check out the website if you haven't already. Everything will be listed on there. Also, if you have any questions, feel free to stop by when I'm streaming on Twitch. I've been streaming pretty much every single day, almost like 10 hours a day, so would love to see more of you guys around. But also, on June 24th, you don't have to stop by regularly, but at least come please. On June 24th, I'm going to be doing a subathon, so every sub is going to extend the duration of the stream, and I'm going to be carrying a lot of people, so helping you guys do Nightmare Dungeons, get your Glyph XP, helping you level up alt characters, etc. I'd love to see more of you guys around. If you feel like supporting, feel free to stop by, but you don't have to support. You can just hang out and even get help yourself. And if I reach my sub goal, I'm going to delete my absolutely perfect ring that is a 4 umbral with literally god roll stats, so feel free to stop by if you're interested in that. But yeah, let's get into the build. Feel free to drop a like, subscribe, whatever, YouTube algorithm, all that crazy fun stuff that everybody loves to say. So getting into the skills, we're going to go with puncture. Like always, we need puncture for the vulnerable application. A lot of people are asking, can you really drop your basic skill with this build? And the answer is yes, in theory, but the only thing that you would swap it with would be Poison Trap. I'm not a big fan of Poison Trap, and the only reason that it could be Poison Trap is because you run out of a vulnerable application if you do not have puncture. And the only way that you could do that on like bosses and mobs that last longer than like 3 seconds would be with Poison Trap and then adding a legendary, or with concealment, but I'm not really a big fan of concealment. So, and you don't really benefit from swapping puncture to concealment. You also lose some damage reduction. It just makes the build feel way less consistent. So puncture for the vulnerable, that's great. Twisting Blades, obviously, best core skill in the game. I've made a lot of other rogue builds. They just do not compare in terms of raw damage. Twisting Blades is simply just way better at this point. Shadow Step and I Dash. Dash is great for the crit debuff. It applies slow. We have some damage reduction versus slowed. Counts as a crowd control. Great for mobility. Dash is our only source of unstoppable, so pretty much need it. The movement speed is great. The lucky hit chance 100%. The crit debuff, fantastic. And it also has a stun, which is really nice to just help our survivability out. And then we go for Shadow Imbuement and the Death Trap. Shadow Imbuement is my favorite rogue skill. If you're trying to quickly farm things, Shadow Imbuement is simply just the best way to do that, because you just nuke entire packs of mobs where otherwise you'd have to chase them down. Blah, blah, blah. If you've used the skill, you know what I'm talking about. Shadow Imbuement is the biggest dopamine factor for rogue, and it's my favorite thing. And I don't really want to play without it, so that's pretty much the main reason that I'm not doing Trap. I have a video on a Trap or Rogue if you're curious on that, but that is why I go with Shadow Imbuement. And we have Death Trap. I personally prefer Death Trap because I think that the low cooldown synergizes very well with our specialization being preparation, which I'll talk about in a second, but also pulls everything in and just nukes mobs as a very low cooldown, so it just works very well with the build. But alternatively, you could go with Shadow Clone if you want to have a little bit more unstoppable every once in a while, and also just helps you for nuking bosses, so feel free to swap based on preference. But unfortunately, the Shadow Clone cooldown is very hard to get lower. My Death Trap is 35 seconds, which could even be lower than that, but it's actually 25 because if I kill an enemy, it lowers it by 10, where Shadow Clone, you just can't do that. You cannot reduce the cooldown on Shadow Clone lower than like 45 seconds. Obviously, you can reduce it more if you use Preparation, but the lower cooldown that your ultimate is, the more value you get out of Preparation, because every time you use an ult skill, it's going to reset the cooldown of everything else. Because Twisting Blades cooldown reduction got heavily nerfed, this is incredibly helpful because we can just get our Death Trap really low cooldown, we can preempt our Shadow Imbuement, so we have Shadow Imbuement for our next 2 skills, then we pop a Death Trap down, and then boom, we instantly have our Shadow Imbuement back. But it's also fantastic for just having higher uptime on mobility skills with Dash, Shadow Step, etc. So it feels really, really good, and every 100 energy you spend, you're just going to reduce the cooldown on your ultimate. But I'm mainly using it for the instant cooldown reset just because it feels really nice playing with it. If you have energy problems, don't worry about playing with prep, just play with Inner Sight and just deal with not having your abilities up all the time. You'd way rather be able to use your abilities. Anytime you're fighting a boss, swap off of Preparation to Inner Sight. It's not hard, just open the menu, boom, Inner Sight. Then when you go into another dungeon, boom, preparation. If you don't swap to inner sight on bosses, you're not going to have a very good time. When it comes to the skill tree here, you want to get vulnerable on puncture, max out your twisting blades, and go for advanced. You could go for the daze with improved if you want, but the cooldown reduction is very good. 3 into sturdy and siphoning for survivability, shadow step for the crit, weapon mastery, 3 into dash, and then I go 1 point to concussive and 1 into trick attack, so we actually can knock enemies down. This is just because we're going to be dazing with one of our legendaries, or you could just swap that legendary off and use improved, right? And then you pretty much infinitely knock enemies down just by spending 2 points, so it really helps with our CC. And then we get 3 into exploit, and then 3 into malice, and then I have another 3 via my amulet, which is an incredible damage increase. And then shadow imbuement with 3 points into consuming shadows, which really helps with our energy generation. When you're not playing with shadow imbuement, you're pretty much forced to play inner sight because your energy regen just really sucks. So this is fantastic. And then I have 1 point into precision imbuement and 3 into frigid finesse. If you do not have the penitent greaves, frigid finesse is not going to do anything, so you'd want to take the points out of frigid, max out precision imbuement, and then put a point into shadow imbuement. And then I have 3 into innervation, 3 into trap mastery, max out the death trap, and then adrenaline rush and haste. Haste, I mean, this is 4 points basically to get 15% movement speed. This is just to be quick. If you don't care about the movement speed, or you have enough you feel like, then you'd want to take the points out of here, put it into like precision imbuement, level up shadow imbuement, or you could even try out agile for just a little bit of dodge chance every once in a while. That wouldn't be too bad. If you want to go with shadow clone, you would just take the points out of trap mastery, take the points out of death trap, and just go into shadow clone and some other stuff. Again, all the skill points, everything will be on the website, so check the website. Thank you. When it comes to our core passive, we're going to be using exposure. Exposure is fantastic because it's just going to proc off of death trap itself, but also if you twisting blades and you have a bunch of orbiting, you're pretty much going to instantly proc exposure, so that's fantastic. And it just helps reduce the cooldown on your death trap a ton, but it also stuns enemies, which is really good for survivability purposes. I would highly recommend playing with it, but if you feel like you have your death trap as much as you want it, I would recommend maybe trying swapping exposure to close quarters combat for just a ton of extra damage, and then maybe momentum if you feel like you're dying a lot. If you're dying a lot and you're just miserable and you are just getting one-shotted all the time and you're not having fun, just put on momentum. It will help a ton. It's 20% DR pretty much all the time. Obviously, if you're playing Shadow Clone, exposure doesn't do anything, so play either momentum or close quarters combat with Shadow Clone. Victimize needs the world's biggest buff. It could be buffed by 300% and still would not be good, so don't use this thing. Just want to talk about that real quick. I'll go over the Paragon board at the end. First, let's talk about Legendaries. Again, the entire priority list of Legendaries and all of the stats that you want on your gear is on the website. Check the website! Subscribe! Okay. Let's get into the legendary. So the absolute best in slot 1 that you need is going to be the Twisting Blades one. You want this on your two-hander because this is the majority of your damage, especially the orbiting effect when you're fighting bosses and very tanky elites. That is your biggest source of damage. One of the biggest changes that I've made with this version of the build prior to my previous one is that I took temerity off. A lot of people asking, why did I do that? Well, first of all, it seems that conceited aspect is bugged right now and doesn't even work with temerity, and the only reason I was using temerity was so that I could gain extra damage. Temerity from a defensive point of view is very bad because even though you get this like massive barrier that is a lot of additional HP, you lose all of these damage reduction stats, and this like nearly 1000 HP is better than temerity by default, but then there's 10% DR, DR from close, DR from distant. Rogue is squishy, man. We need all this damage reduction. So if conceited aspect doesn't even work, just worthless to use temerity, like you're actually nerfing yourself at that point. But also, even if it did work at this point, I really wanted to play with double shadow step, and we can't play with double shadow step because Penitent Greaves is so oppressively strong. Talk more about that in a second. But you pretty much have to play with Penitent Greaves on Rogue, at least for this build. So I don't get the quality of life of shadow step, and freeing up temerity means that I have more defensive spaces, so I don't have to put disobedience on my necklace anymore. I can do shadow step there, so I have double shadow step. This is just 2 charges of unstoppable, but it also means I can engage with my shadow step rather than having to hold it, and it just makes the build flow infinitely better. And if my goal is to speed farm, this actually just makes things way faster because I can just spam my mobility like a psycho, and then I can benefit more from Twisting Blades and Shadow Imbuement going through packs of mobs because I just have more tools to move around mid-combat. Also, Rogue is just absolutely miserable only having 1 source of unstoppable, so having 2 is just a really nice quality of life. So that's the main difference when it comes to the Legendaries. Everything else is pretty much the same. If you don't care about double shadow step, you could put like Edge Masters on the necklace or Accelerating Aspect. Those are probably your only 2 bets, but it's not really that big of a damage increase. Edge Master is good for extra damage. And then I have Vengeful for 9% crit, which is mandatory. Never don't have Vengeful. This is insane. And then we have an Umbral for a ton of energy generation. If you can't get a 4 Umbral, which is very hard. By the way, I will be deleting this ring on stream if we reach our sub goal, so make sure to check out the stream June 24th. If you can't get an Umbral ring, I believe it's called the Ravenous aspect or something. It's energy when you kill a vulnerable enemy, 70%. Use that instead, and it will feel fairly comparable. Umbral is not very good if you're not using Penitent Greaves, though, so keep that in mind. We have Accelerating aspect, like I mentioned. And then on the pants or helmet or chest, you want Disobedience. This is the biggest survivability increase you could possibly use. And then on the gloves, I go for Manglers so that we can apply a daze every once in a while. And then we can pair that with our trick attacks to knock enemies down. Alternatively, you could just use Twisting Blades with the daze anyways, and then gain another offensive aspect like damage to stun or something. And then on the chest, I have Cheats for 19 up to 25% less damage taken from crowd controlled. Just another reason why we need Penitent Greaves, because we instantly are going to apply CC, so we instantly get the 25% less damage taken. And then you want Might, so your basic skill gives you extra damage reduction, which is one of the reasons why swapping off of Puncture doesn't feel very good, because that has a lot of DR, and we are very squishy boys. When it comes to the stats that we want on our helmet, you want Ranks of Shadow Imbuement, cooldown reduction, max life, and then if you want more survivability, you would go for total armor instead of dexterity, or for offense, you go for dexterity. On the chest, you want total armor, damage reduction from close, and max HP. The additive damage here is kind of insignificant, so I don't really like it. Alternative to that, you could get total armor percent as well. On the gloves, you want pretty much exactly what I have: attack speed, crit chance, trap skill cooldown reduction, and ranks of Twisting Blades. The most important two things is crit chance and ranks. If your gloves don't have at least crit chance and ranks of Twisting Blades, don't use them, okay? Most important thing, crit chance is unbelievably strong. Never skip out on opportunities to get crit chance. When it comes to your pants here, I have damage reduction from close, and max HP. Those are your three most important. The last one can be from distant or total armor percent. That would be pretty good. When it comes to the boots here, obviously using the Penitent Greaves. If you can't get the Penitent Greaves, you just want some normal boots. I have an extra pair, sorry to flex on you guys. Where is it? I don't have boots on me. You just want normal boots with movement speed and energy cost reduction, and then you just put the Shadow Step on your normal boots, and then you could put like Edge Masters or something on your necklace, and you could gain like a offensive aspect. The reason that we need Penitent Greaves, I've already talked about two of them: Umbral Ring for extra resource, Cheats are for less damage taken from crowd controlled enemies, but also in our Paragon board, there is an ungodly amount of damage versus crowd controlled. We have Cheap Shot, which is 25% multiplicative damage, so we gain this pretty much instantly the second that we just walk in your enemies with Penitent Greaves on. But there's also a crazy amount of damage to crowd control. Look at this. Damage to crowd control, damage to crowd control. And then we have the Control Glyph, 99% damage to crowd control, 10% multiplicative damage to slowed or chilled, damage to crowd control, crit damage to crowd control. You need all this, man. You lose way too much damage if you don't use this, but you also get 10% multiplicative damage to chilled, and you also get another 15% damage to chilled, which it's just so much damage if you don't have this, so definitely try to get that. When it comes to the crossbow here, you want vulnerable damage. That's the most important thing. Get vulnerable damage twice, and then you want crit damage, and then you want dexterity, and the last slot can either be damage to close, or recently I've done the math. Once you're like level 90, 95, replacing the last stat of additive damage to close or damage with core skill with all stats is actually better, because mathematically, if you have a certain amount of additive damage, around 600% or so, the diminishing returns from this 55% is so bad that you'd actually rather have the 80 dexterity that you get from having all stats, which would just be 8% straight up damage, but you also get 80 intellect, which gives you crit chance, and you would also unlock some of the node breakpoints in your Paragon board, such as this one giving you 15% crit damage, and this one giving you 12% damage to close, and this one giving you damage to elites, simply just by getting the all stats on only one piece of gear. But it would even mathematically be better to do the same thing on your swords. Don't worry about it unless you're level 90. Figured I would just mention that for those of you guys that are curious, maybe on the website, why I have all stats listed. Mathematically, it is simply just superior than having another additive stat here, but you need a lot of additive damage for that to start being the case. People ask all the time, does weapon DPS on the crossbow matter for how much damage you do? No, as long as you are using a melee skill, but the stats on it do matter. Swords are pretty much the exact same thing as a crossbow, but you just can't get vulnerable damage twice. You want to be using swords because they always have crit damage, and they benefit the most from weapon mastery. You want crit damage twice, vulnerable damage, dexterity, and then you'd want, like I was saying, all stats, or you want damage to close or damage with core skill. Same thing on both your swords. On your ring, you want this exact ring. I'm hoping I don't have to delete it, but it seems like I'm gonna have to delete it, so unlucky. But yeah, you want crit damage, vul damage, crit chance, max life, and then the Umbra roll. My god, this ring is so good, man. You want basically this twice, because the max HP is really good on Rogue. This other ring I have is pretty good. Crit chance, crit damage, vuln. Just make sure at the minimum to get the crit chance and the vuln. That's the most important. And then outside of that, shadow damage is pretty bad, but it's not too bad. You get like damage to close, damage to core skill, damage to crowd control. That would be what you're aiming for. On the amulet here, what I have is pretty much what I'd recommend because Rogue is so squishy. You want ranks to, the most important thing is getting ranks to Malice here for 9% increased damage to vulnerable. Alternatively, weapon mastery. I think they're about pretty much the exact same power level, so go for Malice or weapon mastery. Frigid Finesse is okay, but it's more conditional. It is extra top end damage, but it's more conditional. So I would aim for Malice or Weapon Mastery. Alternative to that, you want to make sure to get cooldown reduction, so you have a lower cooldown on your Death Trap and your imbuement skills. That is really good. And then damage reduction is fantastic on the amulet. Total armor is probably the only thing I would maybe swap, because with Disobedience you get a lot of armor. Currently I'm at like 54% baseline, but I could have more armor on my pants and my chest or my helmet. So I'd have higher total armor baseline, and I could swap this to actually trap skill cooldown reduction, which could get my Death Trap to literally a 20-second cooldown, which is pretty insane. Or you could get movement speed was really good, or damage reduction from close. When it comes to the Paragon board, this has changed quite a lot since my previous video. This will be on the website. I'm just going to briefly go over what I'm doing in my board. I've spent a ton of time on this. A lot of math went into this, and this is what I think. There's always optimizations that can be made. I can always make it like a tiny bit better. And I'm not like, you know, a genius. I haven't like calculated Rain Man, the perfect Paragon board. But from what I know right now, this is pretty good and almost as good as this build is going to get, because you just get a crazy amount of damage. But I also made sure to get some survivability for us, which was previously lacking. So I maxed out Closer for the cutthroat skill damage, and the damage reduction is really fantastic there. And then I went and got Exploit Weakness, because this is just a lot of extra damage. I had additional points to do it. If you wanted to lose some damage somewhere, this is where you'd lose it if you wanted to gain more survivability. But the Exploit Weakness board is really fantastic because there's a lot of vulnerable damage on here. But there's also damage reduction versus vulnerable, which is pretty much everything we're fighting. So we get 2, 4, 6, 14% total damage reduction versus vulnerable, and pretty much every enemy we're fighting is vulnerable, so that's fantastic. In this board, I put in combat. However, if you are leveling up, you want to put exploit in. I'm going to link a build for how you want to set this up while leveling, because the board is going to be different. Your goal while leveling is to put in exploit as soon as humanly possible. So no witness, and this board would basically be swapped, and you want to slot in exploit. But this board is fantastic because it has 49 intellect, so we can max out our combat, which is a crazy amount of extra damage, 97% crit damage. And there's even more vulnerable damage down here, which is just really good. This board is actually insane. I basically swapped off of Deadly Ambush because I felt like it was too conditional and you didn't proc it all that often. And I'd rather just have damage all the time than damage only against traps. And the cooldown reduction that I was getting from Deadly Ambush board was heavily affected by DR, so I just didn't think it was worth it anymore. And then you go into the Cheap Shot glyph, or sorry, board. This board is insane. You get control. This is just a crazy amount of extra damage, 99% damage to crowd controlled with only level like 16 glyph or something, and 10% multiplicative damage to enemies affected by slow or chilled. But if you stun them, which you do all the time with your exposure and with your shadow step, that's a ton of extra damage. This is really beneficial for using Penitent Greaves. If you do not have Penitent Greaves, I would swap control for Chip, and I would kind of take some points out of all of this damage to crowd controlled. Chip is great for just doing extra physical damage, and I believe there is enough dexterity in this board, but I have not checked. Actually, yeah, there should be. There's like 20 there. Yeah, there's a lot of dexterity here, so Chip could go here in place of control. And then I got some damage reduction versus slowed. I don't really think this is that good, but I only had to spend a couple points to get it, and our dash does apply a slow here and there. So the DR is pretty nice. Getting this damage reduction from elites would be really nice, but I just don't really have the points for it, and I went for the damage. But if you want to swap out of damage, feel free to go up this way instead, but I like all the damage crowd controlled here. And then I have the Tricks of the Trade board. This legendary node sucks, but I really like this board because there's a lot of damage on here, and the second that I get a all stats two-hander, it's even more damage. You get You get a ton of damage to close down here, but also a ton of damage reduction, which is really cool. And then up here, you get crit damage and physical damage, which is just a lot of extra damage. And on here, you get damage to elites. So this board is pretty good. And there's also a good amount of strength to take advantage of turf to get some more damage, and also the damage reduction. And then our last board, we have no witness. I took the points out of here because I felt like going for more additive damage actually mathematically made sense for us. And losing all these points meant I could get some damage reduction where I otherwise couldn't. There's a world where you go back to grabbing no witness, but I decided instead to kind of just max out our glyphs. I spent a lot of points maxing out exploit here. I got 49 strength, so that's a ton of extra vulnerable damage. This is heavily nerfed, but it is still worth getting because we get some max HP along the way, we get some additive damage along the way, and there's also some damage to healthy and some crit damage down here. I mainly care about the crit damage, so I think that's pretty good. I don't think this is perfect. It could be optimized a little bit better, but this is currently how I have it set up. When it comes to how you actually want to play with the build, you don't have to worry about shadow stepping in and instantly dying anymore because we are playing with double shadow step, so feel free to play pretty liberally. One of the main things that you want to make sure to take advantage of is preparation, because anytime that you use your ultimate skill, being your death trap or your shadow clone, you're going to instantly reset the cooldown on your shadow imbuements and all of your movement. So make sure to use a shadow imbuement before you use your ultimate skill. So pop your shadow imbuement and then it'll just exist pretty much forever, and then you can just use your ultimate skill or something, and then instantly you'll get back your shadow imbuement. So you can basically use shadow imbuement 4 times back to back, and then because you use your ultimate skill, you'll probably get a lot of cooldown reduction for your trap with exposure and with preparation and stuff. So if you're 4 shadow imbuments plus a death trap to absolutely annihilate a pack, you should be perfectly fine going into the next pack with another set of shadow imbuments, right? That's pretty much the core of the build. Make sure to just utilize your mobility to pretty much fly through mobs and have your twisting blades path through everything, and that is the most efficient way to play the build. You don't want to just hit one mob at a time because of the way that the twisting blades return works, and because of the way that shadow imbuement works very nicely with twisting blades. That's pretty much going to be it for the video. If you enjoyed, please make sure to drop a like, subscribe for videos similar to this one, and make sure to check me out over on Twitch for the subathon. I would love to see more of you guys around. Thank you guys so much for the support recently. I appreciate it a ton, and I will see you guys later.